Hello, I'm Bill Bay, President of the American Bar Association. I am pleased you have joined us for the ABA's 2025 Law Day program. This year's theme is very timely: the Constitution's promise, out of many, one. I remember when I first heard the phrase e pluribus unum when I was in grade school, and I learned that it meant out of many, one. It is on the Great Seal of the United States, as well as the seals of each of our three branches of government. But it took me years to truly appreciate its importance. Since its founding, our republic has always been a diverse nation and faced profound challenges, heightened by differences among people in the young nation and different ideas about how to address the problems. Many people doubted that the framers could create one country, one union, out of many. But they found a way to bridge their differences and ratified the Constitution in 1789. For nearly 2.5 centuries, the Constitution has provided the framework for Americans to work together and govern themselves. Today, the U.S. is larger and more diverse than the framers could have imagined, and new challenges continually arise and confront us. But here is the key point. We have the tools we need, enshrined in our Constitution, to work together to meet these challenges. This is a time to celebrate the Constitution's bold assertion: we the people will form a more perfect union. Indeed, there is no better time than now as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. President Dwight Eisenhower established the first Law Day in 1958 as a national observance to advance representative government and the rule of law. This year's celebration of Law Day calls on all of us to renew our commitment to the obligations we have to one another under the Constitution and our democratic norms, including as one nation under law. We have a wonderful program planned today, beginning with remarks from former Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Stephen Breyer. Then Law Day Chair Tommy Preston will have a fireside chat with Richard Haass, former president of the Council on Foreign Affairs and a diplomat. Finally, Nick Capodice from New Hampshire Public Radio and the Civics 101 podcast will leave a conversation with Emma Humphries from iCivics, David McCollough from the American Exchange Project, and Judge Peter Reyes, who serves on the Court of Appeals in Minnesota. I hope you enjoyed the program and help you to understand better the promise of our Constitution and what unites us as a country and people, and why the promise of e pluribus unum, or out of many one, is so important then and now. It is now my honor to introduce Justice Stephen Breyer, who will share his thoughts on Law Day 2025. He's done it all. He's been a law professor, a prosecutor, and an appellate judge. Most importantly, he served on the United States Supreme Court, our nation's highest court, for 28 years. I cannot think of anyone better to hear from on Law Day. Justice Breyer, come talk to us.
Well, I think the legal profession and Americans more generally can learn. How does law work? What is in this Constitution? It doesn't take long to read, and they can understand that there is a legal system designed to allow these people, all of us, to live together peacefully and prosperously. So one way is Law Day. On Law Day, the lawyers can go to the newspapers, they can go to schools, they can go to businesses and explain what they do. and explain how badly they felt when they lost a case, but then they appealed and they won. Or maybe they didn't, but explain how the system works. And I think I would love to see again, and it is true in many states, but not everywhere. When I was in the 12th grade, we had a course in civics, and you had to learn, how does the government, how does this free society, how does this society, which has a free government, a democratic government, tries to protect basic human rights, tries to protect the rule of law, tries to assure a degree of equality, tries to get us to be able to work together under law. I think classes like that in the schools, show them how a court works, use your television, show them what senators do, interview some so they can tell you what their day is like, interview members of the House of Representatives, go and interview the President of the United States. What is his day like? And get the students to understand it. There are museums all over the country. There's a Senator Kennedy Museum in Boston. There is a museum in the courthouse, a library, and someone working there to explain to students how the courts work. Explain all that. And get them to participate. Get them to ask questions, to answer questions. They'll like it. It's fun and interesting. Well, history shows that America's had its ups and downs, but it also shows that we work together fairly well. For example, when we had COVID, there were groups of people going through the streets in Cambridge, Mass, and probably San Diego, and probably St. Louis, and all over the country, groups of people who were looking to see, are old people all right? Are they sleeping all right? Are they eating all right? Do they have COVID? And that's what we're fairly good at, doing that kind of thing. So we are divided on many issues. But Senator Kennedy, whom I worked for, used to say, when you find people who are really don't think what you think, the best thing to do is talk to them. Wait, don't talk too much. Listen to them. And pretty soon, they will say something that you really agree with. And when they do, you say, what a good idea you have. And then let's see if we can work with that. And you might get 30%, 40% of what you want. Take it. Don't hold out for 100% of nothing. So your followers say you're wonderful. No. Try to work out these compromises. You do so mostly by listening and listening for things, and you'll find it that you and they really agree with. This may be one of them. Well, when we are quite divided on issues that matter to a lot of people, I think it is important that particularly those who aren't lawyers understand that it is not unusual. It is usual in a case for a judge to decide the case so that one side likes it and the other side doesn't like it. That isn't some unusual event. It doesn't mean the judge is an idiot. It means that he decided in favor of one party, and it provides a remedy, the law, for the other party. That's called an appeal. You can appeal to a higher court, the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court of the state, or here, this court, and say the judge in the first instance court made a mistake. And if the other judges agree with you, it will turn the case around. But that's the right way to do it under a rule of law.
Thank you, Justice Breyer, for those thoughtful and inspiring remarks. It's a great honor to have you join us for this year's Law Day commemoration. Now I'd like to introduce Tommy Preston, the 2025 Law Day Chair, who will be joined in conversation by Richard Haass.
Hey, thank you, Bill, for the warm introduction. And again, thanks to Justice Breyer for your inspiring and provocative comments. As Bill mentioned, my name is Tommy Preston. I have the honor of serving as this year's National Law Day Chair. I'm very excited for today's discussion related to our Law Day theme, the Constitution's promise, out of many one. Joining me is one of our country's preeminent foreign policy voices, a leader I've admired for some time now, Dr. Richard Haass. And I shared with Richard not too long ago as we were prepping for this session, my first time interacting with him was when I was a student at the University of South Carolina years ago. And Richard was a guest speaker at the university. And I remember being really struck with his candor, his passion for the world, his passion for our country, and this call to action he was given to all of us students at the university at the time. So really honored to have Richard here with us. And I'll share a brief introduction of him before we jump in. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat and respected scholar on international relations. He's president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations after having served as the council's president for over 20 years. He served under 4 U.S. presidents. I might add that both Republican and Democrat presidents, most notably as the U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland to help the peace process in Northern Ireland, for which he received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. A graduate of Oberlin College, Dr. Haass went to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, where he completed a master's degree and doctoral degree. He's the author and editor of 14 books. And his latest book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, was published in January 2023 and became a New York Times bestseller. We'll talk a lot about that book today. But first, Dr. Haass, thank you so much for joining us. All right, Richard, hey, thanks again for joining us for this Law Day program. We're truly honored to have you here with us this afternoon.
My pleasure to be with you. And here I am, this guy who never went to law school. So it's the next best thing. So thank you.
I love it. I love it. Hey, let's just let me start by asking a level setting question. You've had such a distinguished career as a diplomat and a foreign policy leader in our country, but most recently, you've become a key thought leader on our own country's democracy. And I guess start out asking why the shift of focus?
Well, thank you. It wasn't by plan or design, like most things in my life. In this case, what triggered it more than anything was my own answer to a question I kept getting. And I give these talks all the time about foreign policy. And I talk about China or Russia or something about the Middle East or climate or terror. It's a long list of things that concern me. And people would say, well, what's the one thing that increasingly keeps you up at night? Is it one of those things? Tell us which one. And I said, well, actually, no. The thing that increasingly keeps me up at night is us. Because if you look at the last 75, 80 years, the United States has successfully dealt with these external challenges. 4 decades of Cold War, which ended peacefully on terms that were consistent with our interests and values, and any number of other economic or military challenges. And we were able to deal with them in part because we were largely unified at home. Not always consensus, but the debates had parameters. We were prepared to meet our international obligations and so forth. And I said, what worries me now is we're so divided at home that we may not have the bandwidth to take on international commitments. We're so divided that we may not be able to come to a consensus. We're so divided that we're not going to set an example the rest of the world is going to want to emulate. And that's an important part of foreign policy, the example you set. So for these and other reasons, I thought that someone like me, who's a card-carrying foreign policy national security guy, that this had actually become the biggest national security challenge facing the United States. If we could sort ourselves out at home, then I wasn't worried about our ability to deal with the Chinas and the Russias and everybody else. And if we couldn't sort ourselves out, then I had real concerns.
Richard, one of the things that you just mentioned is about other countries emulating us, and you have relationships with foreign leaders all over the world. What are they saying about the United States today, and do you actually think countries still emulate us right now?
This is in I'm sad to say department, less and less. There was a time that they did. They maybe didn't always like us. Sometimes we threw our weight around. I never liked the phrase when we called ourselves the indispensable country and all that. I didn't like when we bragged at times about being the shining city on a hill. But that said, a lot of countries admired us. It wasn't that we were perfect, but that we had the ability to confront and deal successfully with our challenges, whether it was civil rights or uh, anything else. A lot of elites in foreign countries came to study in the United States. Even now, we probably have on the order of 1 million students from overseas, and they see us up close. And I used to say the best way to make the case for democracy in markets wasn't to give diplomats like me talking points. It was simply to show it, to show that it works, to show the economic growth and innovation of American society and the economy. And you didn't need to tell people. They woke up every morning and wanted to be like us. They also woke up in the morning and put on their shoes, and where did they walk? They walked to an American consulate. Why? To get a visa to come and study here. They wanted to get some of that. They wanted to have access to a world-class education and to see this up close. And whether they stayed here, which was good for us, or they took it back home, which was also good, I thought. But no, now I'm really sorry to say, less and less. Our own democracy has, shall we say, deteriorated. We've become, to use the term of art, more illiberal. Measures of democracy, the robustness of democracy in this country have gone down. We can talk about it in greater detail. I think our economy until recently was the envy of the developed world, not so much right now. We're getting in our own way increasingly. So to make a long story short, I think the ability to influence the world through example is less than it was and less than it could or should be.
Richard, this year's Law Day theme, as you know, is the Constitution's promise out of many one. And as we were coming up with the theme for this year, I know our ABA president, Bill Bay, and myself and others really wanted a theme that met the moment of time we're in as a country, but also one that would connect to our citizens. And yeah, one of the first things that came to mind was this book. I see it right behind you, and I have a copy in front of me right now that you wrote back in 2023, the Bill of Obligations. And we're going to spend some time talking about the book today. But one of the things that struck me at the time when I read it back when it came out in 2023 was not only was the message timely, but it was pragmatic, it was direct, and really a call to action for Americans. And you said something earlier that resonated with me, that you kept getting people asking you what keeps you up at night, and that was also in the preface of the book too, at the beginning. Thinking about 2 years later, what keeps you up at night today in 2025 in the United States?
Let me first respond to what you said in the lead up. It is a call to action. We can talk about it. But American democracy, I think, is a treasure. But it's not going to be preserved, much less improved upon from above. I really do think it's a bottom up phenomena, if you will, we the people. And again, one of the things that makes a democratic society democratic is these centers of power beyond government. and it's part of what makes these our society so special in many ways, unique. So I think that's an important thing to think about. It in terms of what keeps me up, I'd say it's the same question, the same thing, which is it's us. And I look at the polarization. I look at the propensity at times for political violence. I see how difficult it is to work across, sometimes within parties, much less across party lines. A lot of the challenges of this country are going unmet domestically, much less internationally. So yeah, everything I wrote about in the Bill of Obligations, I'd say, is true now and then some. I wrote another book. I don't mean to turn this into the Richard Haass Literary Hour, but I wrote a book maybe, I don't know, a decade or so ago called A World in Disarray. And I'd have the same answer, that a lot of the centrifugal trends that bothered me internationally, I look at now and I say, they're still there and then some. If you will, the decentralization of power and the weakening of order at the global level is more pronounced today than it was a decade ago. And I'd say the same thing domestically. Our ability to function successfully, I think, is less than it was 2 years ago. And by the way, the two reinforce each other. Problems here at home don't stay here. They tend to weaken the ability of the world to come together because we've played such an outsized role, and vice versa. Global challenges, think about COVID or what have you, some of the economic challenges we're now facing. Even if things emanate from here, they then come back from there. There really is a two-way echo chamber. So yeah, I'd say my answer to the previous question, what worries me still is us. And if anything, I'm slightly more worried. And I often tell people, Tommy, if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. And I think it's real. And let me just also say, to say that doesn't mean I'm giving up. Nothing. It's the opposite. I feel a tremendous sense of urgency. I feel it's why I do what I do. I feel that it's more important than ever to get informed and get involved, simply because so much is at stake. And history shows that good things just don't happen because they ought to. Good things happen because good people put their shoulder behind it, either domestically or internationally. So I feel, if anything, more, not less urgency than I did 2 years ago.
One of the things I loved in reading the book, and it's right at the start, you dedicated your book, and I'm going to read it verbatim, to those Americans who put country and constitution before personal gain or party and stood up for our democracy when it was most in danger. And again, this year's Law Day theme is focused on the obligations of average Americans to each other and to our country. And maybe I'm putting you on the spot here, but when you think about our country historically and think today, who are some of those individuals that stand out to you as those who uphold those values of putting country and constitution first?
It's a good question. Some people I was fortunate enough to work with, someone like Brent Scowcroft, who I think is the gold standard of national security advisors, in his own quiet, modest way, just showed how the job could and should be done. Colin Powell, when he wrote the book An American Journey, it really was. It showed this kid who grew up, a child of immigrants in the Bronx, and what. It's also one of the things I love about the military. It's been a great institution, particularly in the post-Vietnam period. For it's been a real meritocracy for Americans across the board. But when you look at JFK's profiles in courage, he talked about people in the Senate, if I remember, who did difficult things. But there's so many. I mean, I was just reading the other day Michael Lewis's book about public service. And what was great about these vignettes, these are people I'd never heard of, doing things I'd never heard of. And I love it. And there's probably thousands or tens of thousands of them just quietly going about doing the right thing in as responsible a way as they know how, whether it's at federal, state, local levels, whatever the specific content of the jobs are, just really uh, sacrificing and committing. And yeah, sure, I realize, I'm a grown up. I know there's a lot of people who, shall we say, don't meet those standards. But my guess is there's so many people in this society who are doing this, whether it's through volunteerism, you hear these amazing stories every once in a while, or through public sector, or also what a lot of people do in the private sector. I spend a lot of time in my new life speaking with CEOs and other business leaders, and I see what some of them are doing. Some of these companies are doing not just what they're doing in their business, but they're take an insurance company like Travelers, the way they encourage their people to get involved in communities, to basically join up with their fellow citizens. There's extraordinary things going on in this, but it's the kind of stuff that de Tocqueville was writing about when he traveled around America in the middle of the 19th century. He saw this fabric of society, which is to me a really good word that Martin Luther King and others used. But the idea that, and he saw, I think it was de Tocqueville talked about the associational dimension of America, Americans coming together to do things, or Americans individually doing things. But there's a lot of examples, I think, of, if you will, the famous, but more important than not so famous, just simply getting up in the morning and doing the right thing.
I love that. I want to jump into the Bill of Obligations, and you have 10 of them, and I'll list them out and ask you some questions on a few of them. But maybe before we do that, talk about this dichotomy between rights and obligations, which becomes the basis of your book.
Okay, well, rights we're all familiar with. If you ask people what makes a democracy, often people think about rights: free speech, religion, due process, and speaking to a legal, people in the legal world, assembly. And the Bill of Rights. The Constitution only got ratified because of the Bill of Rights. Those who gathered were worried about creating a strong government with an effective executive, and several states demanded protections against it. And that became the first 10 amendments. Essentially, it was a package deal. You want the Constitution? You give us these 10 amendments. And we did it. And if you think about American history over the last 2.5 centuries, to use Lincoln's phrase, the unfinished work, it's been closing the gap between those rights, the promise of those rights, and the reality. And maybe some might disagree with me, but I think we've done an impressive job. Perfect? No. And there's still work to be done. But I look at how we've progressed as a society. I think I mentioned it before. One of the things that makes a democracy attractive is not that it's perfect, it's that it's willing to deal honestly with its imperfections. And most Americans, I think, are, for good reason, aware of their rights and properly demanding of it. My view is that's great. That's as it should be, but it's not enough. It's, to use the old social science saying, it's necessary but not sufficient. Because inevitably rights come into conflict. The rights of the unborn versus the right to choose. Rights, we had all the disputes about masks and vaccines during COVID. We may have a similar thing now about other vaccinations. The right not to get vaccinated, but what about the right not to be living in a society where certain diseases once again become prevalent? We have the debate all the time about gun control. Rights under the Second Amendment, what's the extent of those rights, and at what point do they conflict with the right to be safe? And we go on and on. Again, I'm not the lawyer, but I would think that a lot of our debates are about either conflicting rights or where we have to limit them, the individual, have the balance between individual rights and the collective good, and how do we deal with those inevitable trade-offs. And my view was that over the years, the pendulum or the balance had gotten a little bit too one-sided in the direction of rights. And while they're explicit, obligations are not. What I wanted to do was have, I don't claim to have all the answers. I will be now uncharacteristically modest for a moment, and say, but rather I wanted to kick off something of a conversation, what you and I are doing. Say, okay, what are the obligations and how do obligations coexist with rights? I love the idea of Americans having that conversation. What better way to mark or celebrate the 250th as we get close to it, to celebrate Law Day, than to think about how we get that balance right. What are the obligations? And the good news is most of the obligations, and we'll talk about it, can be met or fulfilled without in any way contravening the rights of others. And that's a welcome thing. But in some areas there is going to be friction. Fair enough. Then that's why we have courts, and that's why we have politics, is to sort those things out. And what I'm really interested in is not the answer so much, is the process. I want it to be sorted out. I want it to be talked about in an informed way, a civil way, a nonviolent way, and so forth. I want people to respect norms and so forth. That's what I'm getting at. This is, you'll notice in the book, since you're kind enough to mention it and read it, I don't put forward my philosophy, my policy preferences. You might be able to think you got them, but they're not there. Because this is not a book of advocacy for policy. This is a book of advocacy for behavior in a much more fundamental way. And my view is, unless we get the behavior right, we're not going to be able to have the kinds of debates we need about policy.
I'm going to read the 10 Bill of Obligations and dive into a few of them in the time that we have together today. As I was reading this book the first time again, it really struck me just like how practical these obligations are. And, any American could read this book and take away something about it.
Can I just interrupt you there before you read, which is thank you. And that's the whole idea. Again, I mentioned before that these things aren't going to be delivered from above, but everybody, if you will, has the obligation to incorporate the obligations. And lawyers have theirs. Actually, lawyers really have it. If you think about when you're an officer of the court, that's a really interesting notion, that you have obligations, if you will, alongside what it is you're technically in court to do. I love that notion. I think it's I'd almost want to expand it, that we're all officers of the society. And we have to think about what we owe to the process and not just to our preferred outcome. But I also think others, I think the people who give sermons every week in churches and synagogues and mosques, what have you, they have special obligations because they have the pulpit and they have the power of I think parents do, teachers do, business leaders do, union leaders do. What I want to impart is the sense that if this is going to work, everybody's got to take ownership of it rather than sitting back or think again it's somehow going to be solved by others. And I apologize for interrupting.
No, I love that. And one thing I'm smiling here because all the lawyers watching today are saying to themselves, finally someone's saying something nice about lawyers and legal professionals.
I haven't even quoted Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let me read the 10 Bill of Obligations. So be informed, get involved, stay open to compromise, remain civil, reject violence, value norms, promote the common good, respect government service, support the teaching of civics, and put country first. We're going to dive into a few of these today, but maybe share with us, how did you come up with this list of 10?
I wish I had a good answer to that question. First of all, I like the idea of 10 because of rights. Before I became a Middle Eastern Studies major, I was a religion major, so I have a certain familiarity with the number 10. But it just sorted that out that way. When I write books, I do a lot of walking. In this case, in Central Park, And I came up with 10, and I read widely. This is the first book, by the way, I should say, I've ever written that I didn't know a lot going into it. I'm not saying I know a lot now, but I've written foreign policy books, which is presumably what I've studied and all that. But I was learning as I went along. So I was rereading everything from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. I read dozens of Supreme Court decisions and dissents I had never read before. Reread the Federalist and de Tocqueville and Bryce. I read all the inaugural speeches, the farewell addresses. I really steeped myself in a lot of American political history, and these are the things I pulled out. And it's interesting, no one else had done it quite. And the founders, they didn't think there was a need to do it. It's interesting. You read through the Federalist papers, and you don't find this list. And I think they thought it was either obvious or implicit or something. But I don't have a good answer to your question other than I came up with these 10, and I've often told individuals who I was speaking with or groups that I'm not claiming I walked down from Sinai. It's almost like that Mel Brooks film when Moses drops one of the tablets. Who knows what the other 5 commandments were? So there may be another 5 obligations, or maybe some of these ought to be challenged. But it's just where I came out after reading and talking and thinking it through.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge. I know there's school groups watching this today in their civics classes, history classes. I encourage you to think about what are those obligations beyond the 10 that Richard's laid out for us that we might want to.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Well, let's just dive into a few of these. Number one on the list is be informed, and one of the things that struck me in that particular chapter was this notion of distrust in our systems, and we see that manifested in social media, in the news. All the algorithms that tell you what you think you want to think, and et cetera. And I guess I'd be interested in what do you think led to the distrust in our systems, and in the midst of all of these factors that we're seeing out there that make it easy for us to distrust, like how do we overcome that?
2 separate questions. How did we get here? Because we are there. There is tremendous mistrust. And in some ways, some of the mistrust is well founded because a lot of what's out there parading or masquerading as information is anything but. And we've come a long ways from the days of Walter Cronkite, where you had the most trusted man in America delivering the nightly news. I think we've gone from an era of broadcasting to narrowcasting. And you think about it, we've got television, we've got cable, we've got social media, AM radio, FM radio, satellite radio, and increasingly, newspapers. Go on and on. We've got all these sources of information. A lot of them aren't vetted, and so we've got a real problem. And I think the technology has led to it. The size of the country, and when this country was founded, we were 3 million people. Now we're 340 million people. But we live in this age of, I write on Substack. I do a newsletter there. Well, increasingly, everybody can become his or her own publisher. You can put out newsletters. You can become your own television producer or radio producer on these things. The technology has really been empowering, which on one hand is a wonderful thing. On another hand, it ain't wonderful because a lot of people are putting out stuff that is anything but factually grounded, or it's only, even if it's accurate in the narrow, it may be inaccurate in the macro because it's only presenting a very narrow piece of reality. And this is critical because, if Jefferson could have joined us today, he would have said the most important aspect of being a citizen is to be informed. He has all these quotes about if you had to choose between government and the media, newspapers, you choose newspapers. Mm-hmm. It's essential. So I think an informed citizenry is critical. Ironically, it's harder than ever, even though we're awash in stuff. And the reason is a lot of the stuff we're awash in isn't information. Unfortunately, that same stuff doesn't come with yellow post-it note saying, "Read me, ignore that." And so one of the things I've come away with, and I don't emphasize it enough, I think, in the book, is I think information literacy needs to become now a staple in our schools and almost an aspect of teaching civics. An important component of that is teaching information literacy. What's, if you will, good information hygiene? You ask me how we overcome it. That's going to be the way. Congress and the courts have essentially said, we're not going to intervene in what is carried on the internet. That's up to those who put it out there. They're not going to hold the carriers responsible for it for the most part. So it seems to me if we have any protection, it's going to be consumers. You're going to become more critical and more rigorous. We've got to teach that. So I actually think teaching information hygiene is probably the best path here. And there's things we could teach about multiple sourcing, about understanding the kinds of sources, what's the difference between a fact and an opinion, and so forth. Because I don't think we're going to be able to regulate our way to where out of the conundrum in which we find ourselves.
I'm skipping a little bit and not going in order, but since you mentioned teaching of civics, and that was a chapter in the book that I really enjoyed. Your thoughts around that, and you mentioned like we have a positive story to tell, but we don't do it, and that really stood out to me. I guess one data point that was disheartening for me was this notion that only 57% of young people in the world today, and there's a number of young people who are watching this, believe that democracy is the best system, and it's hard to believe living in the United States where people actually think that that's the case. Maybe share your thoughts on that, and where do you see the actual teaching of civics helping us to overcome this moment we're in?
I mean, it's not that hard to believe increasingly, I'm sad to say, because imagine you're a young person and say you're under the age, I don't know, of 30 or 40, which from my point of view is pretty young. And you look at what's happened. You're beginning in 2001 with 9/11, then you had Iraq war in Afghanistan, then you had 2007-8 financial, the mortgage crisis. We've had COVID. We had January 6th, on and on and on. We've had enormous challenges in our society and around the world. And they look at things and go, well, what's so good about what we've got? Maybe wages in many cases did not improve as much as they could or should have. So there's a lot of disaffection. It's what fuels populism in this country and around the world. And I think we haven't done it. It gets to the point where we began the conversation about how do we make American democracy more appealing? How do we make it something that people prize, value? And then also we've got to do a better job at teaching it. People aren't born in this country with in their brain, there's no part of the brain that is the I love democracy part of the brain. It's not in any cortex. There's not a democracy cortex in the brain. We've got to teach it. We've got to basically make the case, this is what a democracy is, this is what it gives you, this is what it requires, this is how it's performed. This is why we think, for all of its flaws, it's the almost Churchillian-like, it's the best form of, or the worst form except for all the others. To borrow from Winston, which is easy to do. But I think we've got to be really systematic about teaching that. And I think we've really fallen down. And those polls are part of reflection. If we're not systematic about teaching, why do we think people are going to come to that point of view? Particularly when so much of the news is problematic, and particularly when they don't necessarily get balanced news, or they get their news from TikTok or from some social media site that has a drum to bang on. So I think middle schools. I mean, what groups like iCivics do, Sandra Day O'Connor, her organization, high schools, colleges and universities. But I don't think anyone should get a high school or a college degree without having been exposed to civics. We wouldn't think of graduating a young person who couldn't read or write or think critically or have, figure out how to get and deal with the internet or something. And down the road, we may add other STEM related requirements given AI. Why is it not a priority to prepare people for citizenship? Why do we think in the world's oldest and arguably greatest democracy, this is something that ought not to be a priority? So for up to me, required course in middle school, high school, and college would be a basic grounding in civics, and then there would be some way of operationalizing it too, whether in the school or in the community. But yeah, I just think that that's got to be part and parcel of preparing people. Think about it: when somebody graduates high school, they go to college, they're at voting age. 18 is the age, and we ought to just do a much more systematic job of preparing young people for citizenship.
You would think that would be a universally accepted concept in our country, and maybe the next obligation around staying open to compromise is part of the problem here. And you have talked a lot throughout your career about compromise, and in this book, and since you retired from the council, you've talked about our country being divided and this loss of civil discourse. And before, I guess a question I would have for you is to get your thoughts on this moment that we're in, and we're talking about all these big issues that we're confronted with as a country, but how do we actually tackle these issues when we can't even get people to get in the same room together to have a conversation?
It's the reason. It's one of the reasons it's so hard to tackle these issues. I'd almost the fact that you have to ask the question in some ways is the answer. In part, we can't agree on the facts. In some ways, we can't agree to get in the same room, or if we get in the same room, we can't agree how to conduct the conversation in terms of civility or avoiding violence. So we've got the political culture has gotten coarser. Let's be honest about it. Again, that's why I come back to things like civics, which I think is really important. Where I'd love to have simulations in classrooms. I love debates. I particularly like debates where at halftime you switch sides, and you have to then adopt the other argument. And the things like compromise, I always tell people, I'm not telling you to compromise. Simply be open to it. Ask yourself, are you better off with compromise or not? What do you have? And then some occasions it may be better not to compromise. I get it. I mean, if we look at what's going on, say, with Ukraine and Russia, I can imagine people in Ukraine say, you know what? We're willing to compromise up to here, but not beyond there. Simply not worth it. And I respect that. But you have to just think through, okay, what are the consequences of compromise, and what are the consequences of not compromise? And again, there's no universal right or wrong answer. I just think it's a drill. It's a discipline that one always needs to go through. Also, by the way, it's one of the reasons I like public service. It's one of the other obligations. I want people who normally would never be in the same place doing the same thing. One of the things I like it is it gets people together who would normally not have that opportunity. When you read Tom Brokaw about the greatest generation, it's what was so good about the draft, what's things coming out of World War II, and people from very different zip codes, if we had, I don't think we even had them then, or socioeconomic backgrounds and so forth. Well, I want to have that now. I would love to see an expansion of public service, because I worry that Americans are increasingly living in what I would call a kind of siloed life, where they don't meet people who think differently, who have different assumptions and backgrounds and experiences. Makes it much harder to find something common to work out, or at least bridge some of your differences. And again, it's one of the reasons I would like to see, again, there's two specific changes I call for, if you will, in the political space. One is civics and the educational space, and the other is public service, either at the national level, it could be at the state level, it could be at the city level, it doesn't matter. But I think there ought to be far more funds made available for that.
You mentioned living in silos, and it immediately made me think about your obligation of promoting the common good. And there does seem to be in this moment Americans not having this sense of care and humanity for each other. And you mentioned in the book living in silos, and I guess I would ask you, and maybe it's an unfair question to ask, but how do you, what happened for us to get to a place where we've lost that common touch, common humanity,
It's a great question.
we would do to get us to, what do you think we do to get us to come back together again?
I don't have a really good answer for how we got here. But ending the draft probably is one thing. We've gotten much larger society. I think the proliferation and decentralization of media had a factor. This, when Robert Putnam wrote his book Bowling Alone years ago, the idea that we've become less likely to do things together, and COVID, I think, accelerated it. Way too much time, particularly young people, spending on devices, which I think has been a really, really unhelpful dimension. I remember it was a couple of years ago, the Surgeon General produced that study of American loneliness, the epidemic of loneliness. But I think for lots of reasons of technology, reinforced by COVID, reinforced by media, I think there's much more separateness. And I think it's extraordinarily unhealthy. How do we overcome it? One, I mentioned public service. I mentioned civics. I think also that's where people who have, I think, religious authority can matter. Preachers have an obligation, if you will, to work at this issue. Parents, to make sure their kids aren't spending all their day on devices. Get them involved in a team sport. I used to think the best thing for a parent was to have every kid do at least one individual sport and one team sport, because they emphasize very different attributes or characteristics. But look for things that them, and also parents have to, and others have to, lead by example. How, Ronald Reagan once said, the most important room in the house is the dinner table and the conversation there. Bring the family together there. Whether maybe it's volunteering for certain things, CEOs can do it, and how they offer certain opportunities or time off for workers to do certain things. But I think we've got to bring that back. And again, we could face some very real public health issues in the near term future if vaccinations fall out of favor. So this conversation may become, shall we say, much less academic very soon about our obligations to one other. Courts intervened in that. You'll remember that, and long before our time, but over smallpox. And that became the idea that individual rights versus collective obligations. And I think we need to, in some ways, revisit again this balancing.
Yeah, I love that. Our audience for Law Day is pretty broad, but as an attorney, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a question about lawyers specifically. And there's a number of lawyers who are watching this program today, and they have this moral and professional obligation to act. And I guess the question for you would be, what should they be doing in this moment in our history to act? Specifically thinking about our legal professionals who are watching today.
I would simply say that, the rule of law is central to so much of who we are as an economy, as a society. So lawyers ought to be speaking up for that, to remind people of the value of the rule of law. That's why in crises, historically, people have brought money into the United States for investment and other reasons, or the most talented have wanted to come here because they could depend on that. So who better to make the case for the rule of law? I also think that lawyers, whether it's through their firms or through the other things they do, their involvement in other organizations, institutions, they are in a position, if necessary, to push back. If they believe that democracy is being threatened in any way, I would say lawyers have the obligation to take those legal skills. I used the phrase before, they're not just officers of the court, they ought to be officers of the society. Mm-hmm. And lawyers, I would say, have an obligation to do that, to take those legal skills and bring them to bear in the courtroom or outside outside the. Let's say one other thing. The Federalist Papers and all that talk so much about checks and balances, and we think of that as Congress versus the executive versus the courts and all. That's one form of checks and balances. But there's two other checks and balances. One is between the federal government and state and local, the federal system. And the other is the checks and balances between government and non-government, between government and the economy, government and the society, government and the individual. So I actually think lawyers have a big role to play there in terms of helping to make sure that those various sets of checks and balances operate as intended, and that whether it's again universities or all sorts of nonprofit institutions and so forth, there will be ample, shall we say, opportunity for lawyers to contribute to the robustness of American democracy.
Thank you. That's awesome. All right, last question. I know this time's gone by so fast today, and really, again, appreciate you taking the time to be with us. We are looking towards fairly quickly next year, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And maybe as we close today, what parting words do you have for our citizens and thinking about that milestone in our country, but thinking about the future as well?
I would hope that every citizen, sometime between now and then, would read at least the first bit of the Declaration before they get into all the complaints about the king. Read the opening arguments, the preamble, if you will. It's a powerful statement. And not to take this, this democratic experiment of ours, as old as it is, not to take it for granted. It really is a remarkable accomplishment. But what I've learned in the last few years is to be very careful about assumptions. And we shouldn't assume that a recognizable democracy will be around for another 250 years or even 50 years for our children and grandchildren, or for ourselves out of self-interest. So people ought to feel a sense of urgency that democracy can't be a spectator sport. Democracy requires, it's hands-on for all of us, lawyers and non-lawyers alike. So this is if there was ever a time to get involved, I think the lessons of the last few years, domestically and internationally, because we have seen backsliding, we have seen a degree of deterioration, is things that are worth saving don't get saved simply because they're worth saving. Yeah. Again, it's because good people do good things. So I would hope if we've somehow managed in our conversation to stimulate or galvanize a few people to maybe think what they're doing, but also what they're not doing, then we will have, I think then we will have succeeded.
Richard, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. And I hope all of our audience members take heed to what you're saying and enjoyed this chat as much as I have today. And I'm leaving here with this renewed understanding of what it means to be an American, and almost in the spirit of President John F. Kennedy, what are our obligations to one another, but just as important to our country. And I think this book is a gift that you've given our citizens, and encourage folks to go out and read it, listen to it on Audible, but more importantly, to think about what we can do as Americans to make our country better. And Richard, thank you for using your voice all over the world, even in retirement, to help make our country and our citizens better. So really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir. I actually work harder now than I ever have, so I think don't believe in retirement. And a happy Law Day to you, to your colleagues, and to all Americans, because we celebrate what is so basic and so precious.
Thank you. You're here. Hey, next today, I would like to introduce Nick Capodice, co-host of the Civics 101 podcast from New Hampshire Public Radio, who will lead a discussion on this year's Law Day theme. Over to you, Nick.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Capodice. I co-host Civics 101 out of New Hampshire Public Radio. I am delighted to be here today with this wonderful panel to, celebrate Law Day in 2025. This panel, we're going to be talking about the theme of this year, the Constitution's promise out of many one, and what that means to each of us in our respective fields and respective sectors. I'm delighted to be here with three individuals, Emma Humphries, Judge Peter Reyes, and David McCollough, and I would love for them to each introduce themselves. So Emma, why don't you begin? Why don't you tell us who you are and, where you work?
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Really happy to be here. My name is Emma Humphries. I'm the Chief Education Officer at iCivics, the organization founded by Sandra Day O'Connor to reimagine civic learning for the next generation.
Judge Reyes, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. My name is Peter M. Reyes Jr. I'm a judge on the Minnesota Court of Appeals. The practice of law is actually my second career. I started out as an environmental scientist before going to law school. I clerked for a judge, worked as an associate law firm, in-house counsel at Cargill for 12 years, and then a law firm partner before I was appointed to the bench in 2014.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judge. And David.
Thanks, Nick. My name is David McCollough. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the American Exchange Project. We're our nation's first 2-week domestic youth exchange program. We send high school students in the summer after they graduate on a free week-long trip to an American town that is radically different from the one that they grew up in.
Fantastic. And I want to hear more about that as we talk this afternoon. I think that just to start things off, I do want to say one of the things I've heard most in, doing this show about civics and even talking to people like Emma and folks at other places like iCivics, is a desire around the United States for civil discourse, for people to speak with each other. So in that, a celebration of that, please, any of you feel free to hop in at any point today to sort of jump off of what other folks say for this panel. But just to get started, Emma, my first, question would be to you. We have spoken many times over the last couple of years about the need to foster and to boost civics education in the United States. And this year's theme is about how the Constitution unites us as one citizenry. But how can we be united? How can we be protected by the Constitution if we don't understand it? So what can we do to, improve young Americans' comprehension of the supreme law of the land?
Yeah, thanks for that. It is hard to imagine that the Constitution can protect us and play a unifying role if an overwhelming majority of us don't grasp its foundational principles, rule of law, popular sovereignty, federalism, limited government, and the like. That said, the Constitution does hold a revered position in the American canon, and I think folks generally respect it and have a solid sense of its spirit. For example, most probably can't define popular sovereignty, but they know what we the people means, right? But that's not enough, right? We have to actually teach it. It seems to me that Americans of all political stripes say they support the Constitution and expect our leaders to uphold it. Unfortunately, when we say that, we're thinking of different parts and different principles, and then we adhere to different interpretations of those parts and pieces. And that's why the Constitution can still be really divisive and really controversial. That's where civic education comes in. That's where the education part comes in. Not to say, here's the proper interpretation, or here are the principles you should care most about or appreciate the most, or the parts and pieces. It's to give students the opportunity to explore these principles more deeply and, more importantly, to talk about them with one another, to come at it with an inquiry-based approach, ask the hard questions about this document, and then have the time in the classroom to speak to their peers about it, go deeper, establish their viewpoints on it, using evidence from this shared document, right? This is all best practices in civic education. But we're not doing it enough. We're not teaching it enough at a time when we need young people to be having these conversations more and more. Lots of states, localities have made it harder and harder for educators to do that. And even when there is no sort of prohibitions or laws on the teaching of controversial topics, there is this sort of general spirit that it's not safe to do so right now. And that's a problem that we need to address. So my position is we need to teach more of it. We need to support our educators. We need to allow young people to have opportunities to talk about the Constitution and talk about all those controversial features of it. And one last point, I come from a group that worked really hard on a roadmap for how we do this type of teaching. It's called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. It's all about following an inquiry-based approach to the teaching of history and civics. And this roadmap has the point of view that all of these sort of controversies and all these disagreements, they are a feature of our form of government, a feature of our Constitution, and they're not a bug. So we should lean into them, we should teach them, and we should let students talk about them.
I love that, you know, a feature, not a bug, 250 years in. Just a quick follow-up to that. I wonder if, you know, some of the folks who are watching today, you know, are curious about, you know, again, 250 years in, was this notion of like a civic education or civics understanding, was that baked in from the beginning? Like, did the framers of the Constitution sort of intend for that to be a really core part of who we are as a citizenry?
Goodness, yes, they did. They cared a lot about education. They understood that to have a free society without an educated citizenry is to have something that never was and never will be. And that's a terrible, not verbatim quote coming from one of the founding fathers, but they understood the important role of civic education, and the civic mission of schools was truly the original founding mission of the great American public school system. And you see it in a lot of missions of different universities, founded in some cases by a founding father. So they knew well that in order for citizens to play their important role, to hold their elected officials accountable, and to truly be we the people in this constitutional democracy, that we needed to educate young people on that point. And I have to give a shout out to the late Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the founder of iCivics. She often said, knowledge of our democracy is not passed down through the gene pool. It must be taught and learned anew by each generation. And we take that very seriously.
Well, thank you, Emma. And I love that quote. Sort of jumping off, you know, what the pillars of democracy are of the United States. It is Law Day. We are here to, you know, celebrate Law Day. And Law Day is a day to celebrate the law, to celebrate and contemplate on the rule of law. Judge Reyes, you know, the rule of law, you know, you and I spoke a little bit earlier, and I have found the same exact thing. Is when you say that expression, the rule of law, it's just kind of like, well, your eyes can kind of glaze over. What does it mean? I think a great many Americans don't know what we mean when we say that expression, the rule of law. So what to you, who has worked in very many different facets in the legal system over the years, what to you is the, you know, rule of law? And what can we all do to sort of encourage its sanctity as a pillar of the United States?
Yes, thank you for that question, and two parts to that question. So with respect to the first part, the rule of law is really the very foundation, the very bedrock of our country, of our republic, of our democratic form of government. So what do I mean by that? I mean, essentially our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our tripartite form of government, which consists of the legislative branch, Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, of which I am a part. As to the rule of law, there are many definitions of it, but I tend to look at it simply, this is in part similar to what Emma does in terms of outreach. I really enjoy going out and talking to students at all levels in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And so I tend to take a very kind of simple approach to trying to explain what I mean by that. So I look at it as rules that we all try to live by based on common sense. And some are based on common law. For example, don't lie, perjury. Don't steal, theft. Don't kill, murder. Other rules or laws are created by Congress as statutes that we all need to abide by, but they have the same force. The executive branch makes sure that the laws created by the legislative branch are faithfully executed, and then the judicial branch, we interpret the laws. As to the second part of your question, what can we all do about it? It's really the responsibility of each and every single citizen of this country to make sure that all of these rules are followed and that all three branches of government are faithfully performing their duties. And that includes the judiciary, of which I'm a part. I consider myself a public servant. I'm beholden to every single citizen of the state of Minnesota and this country. And each and every single citizen has the right under the First Amendment to speak their mind as to whether their representatives in government are indeed following their oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And each and every single member of the legislative branch, executive branch, and the judicial branch, we swear an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States.
Well, just to sort of home in a little bit on one of those, on the judicial branch, and this is, this is Law Day, and, we're here with folks from the ABA today. What about lawyers in particular? Like, what role do lawyers play in that courtroom or working, as advocates? What role do they play in particular in enshrining the rule of law?
Yes, lawyers play an absolutely important and incredibly important part of the role of the administration of justice. They are zealous advocates for their clients, and and they have a duty to fairly represent their clients, which benefits those of us who are judges by having that advocacy on both sides. Now, that representation of clients, some of those clients may not be the most sympathetic, but even people charged with the most heinous crimes are entitled to representation under the Sixth Amendment. And here at the Minnesota Court of Appeals, we hear cases, we hear civil cases, we hear family law cases, we also hear criminal cases. So we have heard the worst of the worst. And we are so dependent on lawyers to provide that representation and advocacy to make sure that we make the best decision, that the laws are followed, and that we reach the right outcome. But I also want to highlight one other thing that's very important to note, because as you mentioned, we are talking about Law Day and we are talking to lawyers, is that lawyers are also officers of the court, and they have a duty of candor to the court.
Mhm.
In fact, that duty is so important that actually overrides their obligation to their clients. So while we expect that lawyers to zealously advocate for their clients, we also expect them as officers of the court to be candid with us with their representation. And that is that balance, that tension that lawyers have to seek. And that is something that we as judges really depend on lawyers and respect their advocacy that they do and the important role that they play.
Yeah, and actually that expression, duty of candor, that came up. We did a Rule of Law live show last week, and that expression came up over and over again with lawyers in the audience and judges who were speaking on the panel. I'm glad you mentioned that. David, to switch over to you, the theme this year, out of many one, which is, e pluribus unum, which what I love about that expression is that we all have a different interpretation of what it means. But what we're talking about today is how the Constitution unites us as a nation. So can you tell me a little bit about, the work that you do at the American Exchange Project? How does travel across the country for folks truly, embody e pluribus unum?
Sure. Well, much of it, I would say, began actually with a constitutional law course I took in college. So second question first. I think e pluribus unum was our founders' way of articulating the fundamental question that any civilization faces, which is how do we all live together? And a constitution is a codified answer to that question, but there's also a social contract that we need as a society, an understanding of one another that we have. Emma mentioned Thomas Jefferson's great line about a nation being ignorant and free never was and never will be. Right now in this country, 3/4 of white Americans don't have a friend who's not white. 40% of Americans have never met a farmer. 2/3 have never met a Native American. In our program, about half the students that travel every year have never been to another state. And so I think while we're insufficiently educating our students in civics, I too often joke that think the average high school student, when asked what Civics is, would say it's an affordable Honda, also are ignorant of one another and our lived experiences. This began in actually in many ways with one of our founding board members, the great constitutional law professor Akil Amar, who was a mentor of mine and was a part of a group of academics who in 2018 were very concerned about how divided we were as a country, and asked me to kind of be the kid to provide some of the legwork on a research project about what scalable social innovation, like a public library or a public high school or a park, could come around right now and bring our divided country together. And we realized after a period of research that teenagers all over the country were voicing a common complaint to a single question. When we asked them what's your least favorite thing about where you're growing up, they would say, I feel like I'm growing up in a bubble and I've never seen life outside the bubble. At the time, I was 24 when I heard that. And I was talking to, the light bulb went off as I was talking to a group of students at the high school that I went to here in the suburbs of Boston. And I thought about the path those 17 and 18-year-olds were about to go down. And not too long ago, I'd been in their shoes. And all my friends and I had gone to basically a version of the same colleges. We palled up with versions of the same people, partnered up with the same people. Most of my friends weren't just living back in Boston. They were living in the same neighborhood of Boston with each other, working at the same few companies, saving money to move back to a town like the one we grew up in. And I thought, it's not just that you're growing up in a bubble, it's that you're living in kind of a railroad car with people who are a lot like you. And Judge Reyes so eloquently spoke about balance and tension and navigating nuance. And I worry that those psychological muscles are going to be very unexercised in the minds of adolescents and adults alike, so long as we're living in communities that are increasingly homogenous. Couldn't have articulated all that then, but when I heard I'm living in a bubble, we thought, why not go live in a different one for a while? And we thought, okay, study abroad, but right here in America. And that's what we do. Over the last 4 summers, we've sent 1,000 students on 150 domestic exchanges for free. We fund every student to 75 towns in 36 states across the country. We'll send kids from Boston, Massachusetts to Riggins, Idaho, from Cotulla, Texas to San Francisco, California. And the whole idea is to immerse yourself with a group of students who are your age from across the country in an American hometown that is culturally and socioeconomically, and then almost inevitably politically, very different from your own. And to see what life on the other side is like. And invariably, what happens when students learn what it's like to grow up on the other side, they themselves grow up there a little bit. And sure enough, host mom and dad become Texas mom and dad. And the new best friends in their town become just best friends that, you know, are, at least we can say now, last the 4 years that the program has been around. And suddenly our perception of the other changes demonstrably. And the method by which we handle that social contract that I believe our laws and institutions depend on is handled in a very, very different way. We talked about, you know, rules based on common sense. And in a country as diverse and as divided as ours is right now, it's sometimes hard to pinpoint common sensibilities that we all share. And I think when you can get away from the noise that is dividing us and those sort of conflict entrepreneurs that are firing on high right now, we can realize that we have much more in common than we might know. And that we, young people at least, can begin to identify common sensibilities on which we can build our future and on which we can apply a lot of the laws and institutions that we've talked about this morning.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, hear,
Yeah,
hear.
Nick, if I could just
hop
chime in,
onto that
I
one.
love everything about this. This is so important. I mean, anyone can just think about the day after the 2016 election, the 2020 election, the 2024. Half the country wakes up shocked by the result because everyone they're talking to thinks just as they do. And how could this happen? Everyone I know was going to vote for so-and-so. I started my career teaching high school government and history in Clay County, Florida, at a school called Middleburg High School. So I came from like the suburbs of Miami, moved to this small rural community, and asked the kids if they'd ever been out of state, and they'd be like, Well, I've been to Orange Park. Orange Park was 10 minutes down the road in the same neighborhood. And so I was one of the first people they met from this, liberal bastion of South Florida, at least it was then at the time. So this is really important. It's hard to hate someone when you've shared a meal with them. It's hard to hate someone when you see them hugging their family and you realize that they love their family just as much as you love theirs, even if they vote differently. And so, David, hats off to this programming you're doing. Let's figure out how to raise $1 billion and do this at scale, because everyone needs to be doing this. I mean, it's so important for young people, but goodness, we all need to get out of our bubbles.
Thank you. And I got to say, a lot of our teachers that run the programming are iCivics teachers. In fact, one of them said, I tell my students that the only inevitable things in the world are death, taxes, and iCivics. So
that makes me so happy.
I'm happy to be on the same side of the coin with you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I was talking with a friend yesterday about this, and we were talking, and he mentioned the draft and the question of and military service as this idea of like, I was thinking about the trope in movies, right? And you got the guys in the platoon who are from all over the United States, and they're all these big pictures of the stereotypes of people. There's always the guy from Brooklyn, right? But it's like, where are we now in terms of like, where is that replacement in terms of just getting out of your bubble and being put in a situation with people with whom you're unfamiliar, in a place with which you're unfamiliar, but it is part of America. Like, what's going to replace that if we don't have that anymore?
Well, thank you. Yeah, Nick, this is an enormous point that we've really identified over the last 6 years. We're hoping that a week in a different town can be as common as the prom, and that one day, 20 years from now, so many young people are doing this that we're thinking like the public library or high school, that it wasn't a novel ideal. So once upon a time, every 3-year-old learning to read was considered a privilege and not a need, not a necessity. We're hoping this idea of relating to one another, of people from California and Oklahoma just getting to meet each other in person, not online, can be like that. And it's especially important for exactly what you just said. It turns out that most study abroad programs were proliferated after World War II as a post-war peacekeeping tool to build civil relations, at first between the nations that had been at war with each other. In 1946, 40 Americans went to high school in Germany and 40 Germans came to high school in America, thanks to the American Field Service. Imagine what the parents of those kids were saying when they came home from school one day saying, Mom, here's what I'm about to do. Now, parents celebrate when you go study abroad. Before that, though, the notion of going away from home to do something that is both challenging and also imbued with characteristics that the adults have decided are really important to our society has been a coming of age ritual for about as long as civilization has been recorded. Think of the Spartans in their loincloths who were given a little bit of food and said, go live in the woods and for a year. And those of you who make it back, we'll call Spartans. And I'm not saying we should do that now. But a big contributor to the divisions that are keeping people up at night and the kind of really disparate ways of relating to one another that we see on display every day. Why is it that one factoid resonates as so deeply true and so deeply false for two different people? I think because at the age of about 17, 18, 19, and 20, we are all coming into adulthood in very, very different coming of age experiences. Inevitably, young people will become adults. They will come of age. If it's on the crew team at college or the lacrosse team or the theater department or the people in the Marine Corps that you've signed up with or the folks getting a welding certificate or the folks in your video game chat room, you will derive your view of the world and your durable friendships in those experiences. And we don't have any uniform coming of age rituals in society right now that I readily can think of. And so I do think it's on folks in our position to come up with a few right now, to come up with some practices that everybody can share that can provide some kind of common sociological language that the young people of the future can all relate to and that can provide a kind of moral underpinning to the way that we relate to each other and to the way that we operate within the laws and institutions that define our society.
You know, David, if I could just add a comment, I find it fascinating, the program that you're involved in, because people are obviously, as you mentioned, are very familiar with programs, exchange programs with other countries, which are phenomenal experiences. And a lot of cities have a sister city, like for instance in Japan or Germany, like you said. But I'm fascinated by the idea of having exchange programs within our own country. And you talked about how having something for people, teenagers who become adults. I can't help but the idea that popped into my mind, image that popped in my mind was the Breakfast Club. They're celebrating their 40th anniversary this year, and all 5 original cast members got together. But think about how 5 individuals from completely different groups were put together in one room. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, and a lot of stereotypes and misperceptions. But then the 5 of them walked out of there as best friends. And I think it just goes to your point. I know it's a kind of a simplistic analogy, but I tend to think in simplistic terms. But you know, it's the idea of when you move past stereotypes and perceptions that people have of others, and actually get to know them as people, as individuals, there's a profound change that takes place. And Emma, you talked about, both of you talked a little bit about, the division in this country. I come back to a comment when we're talking earlier. Emma, you had mentioned and you started reciting the Constitution, the preamble of the Constitution. And I had the exact same thought. Think of the first 7 words to the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States. It's not us, the people, or us versus them. It's we. We're all united as a country, as citizens of this country, which is a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm a first generation college student from grandparents who immigrated here from Mexico. I'm the first Latino to be a judge on the Minnesota Court of Appeals. I firmly believe I'm living the American dream. The opportunities here are incredible, but like you said, Emma, earlier, we have a tension here, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. We can still agree to disagree and still have respect for each other. My last comment is, the other thought that comes to mind is the Pledge of Allegiance. That's something we all know, that's something we all say. We put our hand over our heart. And the last part of the pledge, which is a very short pledge, actually, we talk about one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And every time I say it, I think about those words. Those are very, very powerful words. That we are one nation under God, we are indivisible, and we want to provide liberty and justice for all. That's part of our Constitution. That's part of our Bill of Rights. That's part of the rights that we enjoy in this country, which makes this country such an incredible place to live and to pursue whatever dreams that you have.
Judge,
And those documents.
Oh,
go
you
ahead.
go ahead. You go ahead first.
Okay, those documents are shared inheritance. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Pledge. I realize is something we recite more than we think of as on parchment paper, but these are the things that unite us. But we have to teach them, and we have to have students understand these concepts. And I've heard people say things like, I didn't get up and recite that pledge every day of my life for 13 years. Just to watch it fall apart. And I think people could say that across the political spectrum. It's, I'm not trying to make a partisan point here, but that's the tension. We come in, we interpret these things differently. So we need to treat classrooms as the laboratory spaces they are, the laboratories of democracy, and allow students to talk about these more deeply. And again, in an inquiry-based fashion where they're thinking about looking to these documents for evidence, forming their claims, and then articulating their point of view.
And I will say, it's we the people in order to form a more perfect union. And that act of coming together comes before peace, it comes before commerce, it comes before domestic tranquility. In other words, that the whole action of this country is an action of unifying, of e pluribus unum. And there's, I think, an evolutionary trend that suggests that unified elements that come out of diverse bodies are stronger than those that are homogenous. My sister-in-law is a pediatrician who's just found out that she is pregnant. And her and my brother-in-law are having a baby. It's really exciting. And she was telling me all the science, because she's a pediatrician the other day. And it turns out that people from different cultures that have a baby are less prone to epigenetic diseases, the child is, than those who don't. In other words, coming out of many one is a act of kind of almost biological strengthening of a society. And I think that's why in our Constitution, it comes before everything else.
I think that's tremendous. I was, listening to something by like the Silk Road Ensemble and Seiji Ozawa, and this notion of where different things, different environments touch each other, like the taiga near the tundra, or one rainforest near a plain, for example. Those areas where things interact from, different biomes, those have the strongest, most resilient, flora and fauna because of that. And that extends to us too, David. And Judge, when you referenced the Breakfast Club, that's maybe one of the more perfect analogies I've heard. If we remade the Breakfast Club today, I've thought about this a lot actually. You'd have the kids would sit down, the principal would give a speech, everybody would pull out their phones, and not a word would be spoken for the 8 hours, and that would be the movie. But that's the real, that's the nut of what we're talking about today, is how to, going back to only connect, right? How do we foster this in spite of the division actors or the conflict entrepreneurs? How do we reach across, we say reaching across the aisle, but that feels like, what does that expression mean? But yeah, how do we do it? What does it take for us to talk to somebody else, to have civil discourse, to hear their opinion, to disagree? I think something has to be done first, though, right? You can't just say everybody should be like we were 30, 40 years ago and be able to talk to each other. Like, what must be taken for that to happen in America right now?
Yeah, if I may start, because I see this in court every day I'm in court. I see this. Lawyers are trained to disagree and disagree forcefully with each other. I have appellants who come before lawyers represent an appellant, lawyers represent a respondent, and they will come and they will argue, and they do a wonderful job. They give their best arguments, and they go back and forth, and they say, with all due respect, I disagree with the appellant because of XYZ. I disagree with respondent because this is how I interpret the law. This is how I see it. After the oral arguments are done, almost every single time, and it just warms my heart to see this, they walk to each other and they shake hands and they say, good job. And that, I get chills down my spine, even right now, just thinking about that, because that is part of the civil discourse. Lawyers can show, and they do it all the time, but they can show by example. They can teach by example of how everyday citizens can do that as well. And so I think that's one of the responsibilities that we as lawyers and judges have, to the greater community, to make sure that we teach them how you can agree to disagree, how you can argue with somebody in a way that's respectful. It can be forceful, it can be earnest, but it can still be respectful of the other person's position, and then listen. I think that's the other active key component, is active listening to what the other side is, not in anticipation for your next argument, but what is Emma saying? What is her point here? And listen to that, give it some thought, and then respond.
I appreciate your point about judges or lawyers and judges serving as models of how to argue better. Judge Reyes, I'm a big fan of Eric Liu out of Citizen University, and he founded something called the Better Arguments Project, which was born from this idea that not that we need to argue less, we just need to argue better. And he lays out the principles of a better argument, take winning off the table, embrace vulnerability, prioritize relationships, listen passionately. I mean, this is how we need to be preparing our students again in classrooms, having these experiences to engage in these ways and stop saying, we can't talk about politics or religion. Well, what are we supposed to talk about? Those are two of the most interesting subject matters. We just need to learn how to model them better and practice them better. And right now, there just aren't a lot of models. If you thought the way you're supposed to talk to someone across differences from what you see on TV or 24-hour cable news, you're just going to walk in and start a shouting match, and that's not helpful.
Well, we need refs, right? I mean, in the classroom we have a ref, and in the courtroom we have a ref. I mean, forgive the analogy, but someone who understands what's going on and holds everybody accountable to what they say, and ensures that little holy trio, which is respect, honesty about what you're actually feeling and what you say, and curiosity. If you have all three of those, you can have a civil conversation. So I feel, out in the real world, out at the bar, out at the coffee shop, out at the market basket, sometimes you need a ref, you need someone to tell people what the rules are of engagement. And I think, but I'm just so grateful that you're modeling that, Judge. What you are doing, what lawyers are doing in the courtroom is something we should all aspire to. And I appreciate it.
Yeah, Nick, when you talk about ref, that's something I think just about all of us have experience with. And again, I think of it in very simple terms. Who was the first referee that we had growing up? Our parents.
Yeah.
And what happened when there's a disagreement between you and if you had siblings, you and your siblings? No, she did it. She's the one who hit me first. No, he hit me first, or he took this and this is mine. And you go to the parents and have them resolve it. In school, you have teachers that resolve it. And the idea of having a referee, obviously in the legal world, we have judges who are the referees, the neutral arbiters. But that's not actually a bad idea in terms of when we have civil discourse to say, hey, it's okay to bring somebody else into the conversation to moderate it if you want. That's certainly an option as well. The other idea that I really like that you threw out is laying out the rules of engagement right at the very beginning. Just letting them know, okay, I know we may not agree on these issues, but let's agree on some basic rules. Let's have a conversation. Let's listen to the other side. Let's be respectful. And after we're all done, let's shake hands and walk away as friends.
I think
Judge
you go ahead, David. Sorry. Yeah.
This is an enormously important point, and the critical piece that I think applies right now, and especially to the listeners of this session, is that referee has to be someone who's trusted, and that can be a very challenging and fickle thing in a time like this. And what we've seen with trust is that it really comes from transparency and the ability to be human. The new movie Conclave had a great line. It said, certainty is the enemy of unity and the deadly enemy of tolerance. And without doubt, there'd be no need for faith. And fundamentally, the reason that lawyers shake hands after a case, I was a baseball player, the reason we go and high five and good game the other team was out of a kind of faith for the other side and allegiance to the game more than the outcome of the moment. And for whatever reason, I think people are leaning very deeply toward the outcome of the moment and toward needing to win over their allegiance to the game at writ large. And that is coming out of a kind of certainty born from insecurity. And I think if you're finding yourself at any point in life in the position of refereeing whatever moment, it could be with the warring children, it could be at the head of your classroom, it could be in your office, the ability to be transparent and to kind of cede to your own faith of the people in the room will, I think, create the kind of trust that is needed on the part of the folks that are on both sides of the conflict the trust that they have in the referee, because the referees play an especially important role. In our program, we call them exchange managers. We hire teachers who become the beloved Mrs. Humphries in her rural town who welcomes kids from all over the country. And we spend hours and hours training them on how to facilitate planned and unplanned conversations on difficult topics, how to get students who are really diverse to come out loving one another, connected to one another for always. I mean, these are the critical folks. And the reason we work with the beloved local high school teacher is because of the trust that they invariably have of the folks in their community. It's the critical element right now.
Well, wherever we are, in all of our different institutions, there is one referee, and it's today's topic. It is the Constitution. The Constitution is all of our ref. It keeps us in check, but through keeping everyone in check, it protects us. And that's what today is about how, the unity under the Constitution and trusting in its protections, it allows us to have civil discourse and to, be what the framers really intended as a nation. I think we're actually out of time, but I mean, unless anyone has a sort of a Parthian shot, there's something they would like to add in as we sort of wind up today. Judge, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add to your comment about the tension, and that really it's baked into the Constitution with, like I mentioned earlier, the three parts of the government. There's a natural tension between the judicial branch and the legislative branch and the executive branch. And that was intentional. The founders understood that each branch is going to be exerting its authority, and it's incumbent on the other branches to say, no, wait a minute, you're overstepping your authority, and this is for the judicial branch to say, no, this is what the laws mean, and then for the legislature to say, I think the judicial branch overstepped its authority, so we're going to change the laws, and we have the authority to change the laws, and the executive branch as to which laws it will and maybe will not enforce. So there's that tension there, but it's purposeful, and it's something that we live as lawyers every single day in our exercise of enforcing the laws of this country. The last thing I wanted to mention is David had mentioned that trust in the judiciary, and I talked a lot about the role of lawyers, but I think the flip side is there has to be trust in the judiciary as well, that we will be fair and objective in our decision making. And I will tell you, I've had the privilege and honor of serving this role for 11 years now. I've been able to travel all over the country, and in fact, all over the world, and meet judges. I just met some appellate judges in Paris last year. It was an incredible experience. But I've met judges throughout the country here in the United States, through the ABA, through the Judicial Division, through other organizations. And I will tell you, judges are so intent on and focused on trying to get the decision right, to be a fair administrator of justice. People don't become judges for the pay. It is not a position that if you want to make a lot of money, go into private practice or do other things. It can be very isolating at times. But I would say the judges I've met across the state of Minnesota, across the country, their goal is to be a public servant and to do the best that they can in this position. Do we get it right all the time? No. That's why we have an appeals process. If I get it wrong, then the Minnesota Supreme Court can step in, or the United States Supreme Court and say, wait a minute, no, sorry, I know you did your best, but you got it wrong. But that trust in the judiciary, I think, is vitally important. That's a role that I know judges across the country try to abide by each and every single day.
And I'll just add that you could make almost all of those same points about teachers, especially social studies teachers. These are folks who went into the profession because they love their country, they love our Constitution, they love our form of government, and they want to instill that love and passion in their students, and not blindly and not without critical thinking, but to have that exposure to it. And that's why I love iCivics. It's the perfect marriage of sort of this commitment to the judiciary that you're talking about, Judge, and trust in the judiciary, and then trust in educators. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor founded iCivics because she was so concerned about what she saw as increasing attacks on the independence of the judiciary and decreasing trust in the third branch. And so she came in and went to educators to support them because she trusts them. And the more we trust our educators and the more we trust them to do their jobs, the more I believe we will restore trust in our democracy and in our institutions. They go hand in hand.
Well, Emma, Judge Reyes, David, it was a delight to talk to you all today. Just thanks to you, thanks to the American Bar Association for having this panel. I encourage everyone out there watching to definitely look at the work that iCivics is doing. Definitely look at the work that the American Exchange Project is doing, because it is fascinating and it just might make that more perfect union. So thanks to the three of you, and have a lovely afternoon and a happy law day.
Thank you, Emma, David, Judge Reyes, and Nick for joining us today and for that enthusiastic and fascinating conversation. Again, I want to thank Justice Breyer and Richard Haass for their contributions, as well as to recognize Tommy Preston for his spectacular and wonderful leadership. I hope you have enjoyed this program and found it as interesting and inspiring as I have. Thank you, the audience, for taking the time to join us today for this celebration of Law Day. And don't forget the most important part of today. It is what unites us that matters the most. That's the Constitution's promise. Out of many, one. Thank you.